Welcome to the Texas News Podcast, where we dive into all things Texas politics and the future of independence in the state of Texas. On today's show, the United States is breaking apart. Some people think that Texas is the only state with one foot out the door, but there are actually other states where support for secession is surging and ready to hit the tipping point. We're going to explore which states are in the running for the title of most likely to secede and why support is higher than the federal government wants to admit. So don't go anywhere. All right, so glad you could join us for another episode of the Texas News Podcast. Today is going to be, for me, quite an interesting one. You've got, this sentiment that exists out there, which I'm okay with, that Texas is the one that is most ready to leave the Union. But new numbers show that there are actually others that are in the running, as I said, for the title of most likely to secede. And I want to cover that today, and we're going to go in depth and really unpack, because really what this means is that the United States is flying apart. States are ready to withdraw, and in larger numbers than I think the public is generally aware. So just a little bit of background. One of the things that we've talked about on this podcast, one of the things we talk about in the TNM and have for quite some time, is this upward trend in polling numbers for Texas. And of course, obviously, we're focusing on Texas, but we have seen this clear upward trend all the way from the polling that hit in 2009. You see a through line into 2014 with the Reuters Ipsos poll right around the time of the Scottish independence referendum. I mean, you've got this whole host of other polls, but then you had the Survey USA poll in the summer of 2022. And that Survey USA poll showed that 66% of likely Texas voters were ready for Texas to leave the Union. Now, those numbers, if they were just sort of on their own, might be a bit of an outlier. You would have a reason to cock an eyebrow and think, what in the world's going on here? There's got to be something wrong. But when you look at the trend, it's very clear that it's been an upward trend since 2009 all the way to today. So as you can imagine, as we have been all over the news lately, the Texas issue, cover of Newsweek, go on and on and on, polls started surfacing. In fact, Newsweek commissioned one with a company, I believe, called Redfield Strategies, and it showed support in the 30% range here in Texas. Then you had YouGov, which if you don't know who YouGov is, just go look them up. But major polling firm. They released one right on the heels of the one commissioned by Newsweek, and it also showed Texas in that 30% range of support for Texas. And so what I want to do, though, is, other than that particular takeaway about Texas, I want to talk about the other results from that poll. Because when you begin to look at those numbers, you're going to see not only is the story much bigger than I think anyone's giving it credit for, but also that support is probably going to be much, much higher than you could possibly imagine. So what we're talking about here today is we're talking about this YouGov poll. They conducted what they call their daily questions survey, which is conducted online, and it was conducted from February the 2nd through February the 5th of this year. And their sample size was quite large. It's 35,307 adults in the U.S. Now, we can get into some of the methodology. They make some of the same mistakes that a lot of the polling companies make. I know the Reuters Ipsos poll in 2014 was problematic with this as well. Is they want to collect a large sample size without giving any type of credence or I guess really thinking about how large those sample sizes should be in each state. And typically it's because those polling companies want to go out there and say, look, this percentage of Americans are ready for their state to leave the union, right? And they just sort of average it out across people in all 50 states. They don't tell you, well, this is heavily weighted in Massachusetts versus Texas, et cetera, right? So there are some methodology mistakes there. But we'll get into that in a bit. But the question that they asked the respondents was this, and this is very important, so pay attention. Would you support your state seceding from the U.S.? That's a very simple question, right? And the results, though, from that very simple question really should give anyone pause. And so what I want to talk about right now is I want to shift into those states that it showed were the highest, right? That were polled by them using their methodology, the most likely to secede. And topping out the list was Alaska, which had 36% support for leaving the Union. Now, Alaska, this is really no surprise to anyone who has watched Alaska or Alaskan politics over the last 50 years. And let's be honest, no slight to our friends in Alaska, but no one really does until John McCain picked Sarah Palin to be his running mate, right? And one of the things that came out about that was Sarah Palin's husband, Todd, his membership in an organization called the Alaskan Independence Party, which is your first tip-off as to why Alaska might have topped the list. Now, Alaska's home of the Alaskan Independence Party, and it was founded in 1973, which is that story, if you haven't looked into it, it is just amazing about the founding of the Alaskan Independence Party, its leader, what happened to them. But the Alaskan Independence Party has been a fixture in Alaskan politics for a long time. In fact, in 1990, Wally Hickel, who was the former U.S. Secretary of the Interior, was actually elected governor of Alaska, running under the Alaskan Independence Party banner. So they actually have had a governor. And of course, what they're after is they want Alaskan independence. It's baked in the name. And so, looking at that percentage as high as it is, understand that their motivations for Alaskan independence really center around some of the grievances that Alaska has very specifically with the federal government. For example, federal land ownership. The federal government, much like a lot of the states in the western part of the United States, the federal government owns a tremendous amount of land and manages that. And of course, the Alaskan Independence Party argues that it really limits Alaska's ability to fully exploit and benefit from its natural resources. So, this is one of the big issues of the Alaskan Independence Party, because so much of Alaska is owned by the federal government. And we know that when the federal government owns something or gets its hands on it, it really doesn't want to release control of it. Additionally, and really linked to this issue of land control, is resource development, right? They want to be able to develop their resources. They believe that Alaska should have more autonomy over the development of those resources, oil, gas, minerals, without all of the federal restrictions or oversight. Oddly enough, it's a very similar argument to what Texas has in relation to the federal government's attack on the energy sector here. Right. So, but obviously at the core of their argument or motivation for independence is really autonomy, self-determination. They want a referendum. They want Alaska to be a self-governing independent nation. And for any of you people out there that are want to make the case that how in the world could Alaska be a self-governing independent nation, understand that you could take almost any state in the union and compare it against the other nation states of the world, and they're going to rank really well among the world, whether it's GDP, natural resources, workforce, et cetera, et cetera. And so, we say this all the time about Texas, but if Texas can't make it, who can? Well, that goes for the vast majority of other states in the union as well, and Alaska especially. Now, in addition to to having Alaska and Texas in the top, California comes in, and look, they came in with a solid 29% in this poll. Now, let's be honest, California is always in the running when it comes to independence polling. Californians, I think, inarguably also exist within the union with one foot out the door. And so you're always going to see them, right? And so you've got an active movement in California. It's home of the Cal Exit movement, led by Marcus Ruiz Evans. And Marcus, I'm not going to speak for Marcus, but Marcus was a guest at our Texit conference that we had at the tail end of last year. And he shared a lot of the findings and experiences that they have in the Cal Exit movement. But understand that California has this very similar attitude related to its relationship with the federal government that Texas does. Look, California has the largest economy of all the states in the U.S. I mean, its GDP is $2.9 trillion. And just to give you an idea of where it would rank, right now Texas is the 8th largest economy in the world. If California was a separate country, its GDP would rank 5th globally. Right, it would be behind Germany and Japan, and California's economy is currently larger than that of the UK, India, and France. So you've got already this sort of economic play where people can look at it and go, look, California economically could do quite well as a nation among nations. And in fact, the governor there, love him or hate him, completely irrelevant to this conversation, but Newsom has repeatedly and publicly referred to California as a nation state and made no bones about it. No apologies, no equivocation. He referred to it as a nation state. So at some level, I think Newsom gets fundamentally what the relationship is between the states and the federal government. Now, does that mean that he doesn't want to see the federal government or California's policies forced on every state through Washington, D.C.? That he might like that, but who knows? But look, understand that supporting California is high because of the main drivers. Really, it's the political differences, which I just highlighted, right? Let's be honest. California's political landscape is predominantly liberal, especially in the major urban centers. Now, some people can argue that California has got several red places, but at this point in time, you have this ideological mismatch. Those that would consider themselves red or conservative or Republican are all effectively fleeing California to go to states that more align with their ideology, thereby strengthening the liberal base within California. And so, a big driver for California independent support is really this ideological mismatch. California is probably one of the most liberal states in the United States, and they don't want to be beholden to senators like Ted Cruz or John Cornyn. But, and of course here in Texas, we think John Cornyn's a liberal, right? So, they don't want to be beholden to that. And it's a very similar situation to us, right? But political differences are one of the main drivers. Additionally, one of the main drivers is their economic strength. They look at U.S. federal policies and the dysfunction and sort of morass in Washington, D.C. as holding them back economically. Again, a very similar case to what we're making here in Texas. Our economy's booming, but it's in spite of and not because of our relationship with the federal government. And California is effectively the same. And of course, I'm not talking about internal economics, right? We know everything there's higher than a cat's back. We know they got budget issues and things of that nature. That's not what's on the table here. We're just talking about its ability to transact in its economy, or transact through its economy in a way that makes sense for California, whatever that may be. Okay. Again, no judgments. But also, much like Texas, California, they feel like they have a distinct cultural identity that they feel is at odds with the broader American culture. And so it really propels them in the same way that culture propels Texas toward independence and support for independence. It's a big factor. And then, of course, you can get into issues that California has related to environment, regulatory policies, immigration. They have, much like Texas, fundamental differences with the way things are being governed or managed by the federal government. And so, I mean, I'm sure you've picked it out by now that many of their motivations are the complete antithesis of the reasons why Texas is seeking independence. Uh, and it really, at its fundamental level, is not really different. It's just on the surface, those things are different. They have a different worldview. We have a different worldview. And the fact that we're being forced to be in this union together highlights the fundamental brokenness of the federal system. But understand that California coming in at 29% is also proof that the idea of secession or withdrawing from the union is not a Republican or a right-wing issue. And this is, I think, going to highlight this as we move on, right? So we've got Alaska, we've got California, we've got Texas, but here's what you have to realize. In this survey, the results, there were a total of 9 states that polled 25% or higher in the YouGov poll. And here's some shockers for you. New York, 28%. Oklahoma, 28%, which is kind of underperforming when we say that Oklahoma is really the largest county in Texas, right? But you had Georgia at 25%, West Virginia at 25%, Nebraska at 25%. And then, oddly enough, not a state, but surveyed in this YouGov poll, was D.C. Yes, the good old District of Columbia, who actually tied Texas in support for withdrawing from the Union. So you've got a contingent there that wants to make D.C. a state, but then you've got a contingent that say, we would rather just have D.C. out of the Union, which when you think about it, is just absolutely incredible. I mean, honestly, I could record an entire podcast episode on D.C. Wanting to leave the Union and what the implications of that would be. But alas, no one would listen to it because, let's be honest, federal bureaucrats probably not going to be watching or listening to this podcast. But it really gets worse. I mean, because that's 25% or higher. But understand that in this survey, there were another 15 states that polled above 20%. So between 20 and 24%. That included Florida, Washington, Indiana, Montana, Louisiana, Arkansas, Alabama, Kansas, Illinois, Colorado, Tennessee, Nevada, Idaho, Delaware, and Hawaii. Now, do you notice something about those? There are no geographic blocks. You know, it's not this is the South or this is the Northeast or the Northwest or the Southwest. It's everywhere. It's not sectionalism. It's not regionalism. It's people that are saying, hey, we feel like the best people to govern us just happen to be us. But understand the implications of these numbers, right? If you're going to take the YouGov numbers at their face, that means that you could travel to nearly half of the states in the union, get out of your car, look around, and between 1 in 5 and 1 in 4 of the people that you lay your eyes on want their state to leave the union. Those are phenomenal numbers. Phenomenal numbers. I mean, for us and for people who really believe in the idea of self-determination, but for the United States federal government, those numbers are bad. Really, really, really bad. And they're about to get a whole lot worse because I alluded to this a moment ago, but I'm going to tell you that these numbers are actually lower than they should be. And the reason is that polling companies have no idea how to poll the issue of secession or withdrawing from the Union. And so, but, there's a little bit of suppression that you could think of. But what if I told you that these numbers are likely actually much, much higher than what's reflected in the YouGov polling? Well, here's your first sign that the numbers are out of whack. And it's our good friends in New Hampshire. Many people, we've had several leaders in New Hampshire, political leaders in New Hampshire, on this very podcast. And so you take New Hampshire and you realize that in this YouGov survey, they polled at a measly 15%. Okay, now I want you to understand that this is a state that's home to the Free State Project, one of the most successful organized political relocation programs ever launched, right? You have multiple political organizations there pushing for an NH exit, a New Hampshire exit. You've had 2 back-to-back legislative sessions where bills to withdraw New Hampshire from the Union were introduced that had committee hearings. They were debated on the floor of the New Hampshire legislature. So how in the world is support for withdrawal in New Hampshire at only 15%? But, we think that number should be higher based off of what we're seeing, but it's not enough for us to think the number should be higher. We've got to absolutely conclusively show that number is off. It's just not right. Well, good thing for us, coming back to California, right on the heels of this YouGov survey, the Independent California Institute commissioned their own poll, and it literally ran immediately pretty much after YouGov did their sampling at the beginning of February, okay? And so they commissioned their own poll, also from YouGov, and they got a very different result. So if you'll recall, when I talked about California, YouGov found only 29% of the people that responded were in favor. But in the poll that was commissioned by ICI, that poll found that 58% of Californians are in favor of seceding from the United States. Okay, so you had the YouGov Daily Question Survey that ran just first, and then you had this ICI poll also conducted by YouGov. The first one showed 29%. The one that was commissioned by ICI got 58%. So how can you explain an almost 30-point gap between 2 polls on the same subject run in the same month by the exact same polling agency? Well, it turns out that asking the question correctly can actually elicit a more honest response. And this goes back to what I said at the very beginning, which was pay attention to the question that YouGov asked in the first poll. Would you support your state seceding from the U.S.? Okay. So when you ask the question, you find 3 main differences between the 2 polls. The ICI poll did not have a not sure option. In fact, they also asked specifically about peaceful secession, and they also asked about being better off, not whether California should secede, but if people thought that they would be better off. So in short, people were forced to choose, which makes sense, as withdrawing from the Union is a binary choice. They were asked about their perception of the outcome. Would they be better off out than in? And in my opinion, the biggest differentiating factor was asking them about peaceful secession. It seems as though when you flash ideas of violence and civil war in people's minds, they get a little cool to any change to the status quo. No one wants violence. I mean, that's the thing about this. We've said it time and time again on this podcast. People don't want violence. We are after a peaceful legislative process that has a vote of the people, a referendum, right? And if you want to see this conclusively, go look at the difference, right? The Survey USA poll in 2022 showed support for Texas withdrawing from the Union at 66% of likely voters. as opposed to the YouGov poll, which had Texas at 31%. Again, a 30-point-ish swing. But remember, the Survey USA poll asked about peaceful secession. And so it does make a huge difference how you ask the question and how you frame it to those people that are answering it. When you, in fact, I would even argue that the polling is incorrect, mostly because they're asking a secession question, and that's not a question that's going to be on the ballot. It will never be asked that way on a ballot. In fact, here in Texas, the Texas Independence Referendum Act specifically states that the wording is to be, should the state of Texas reassert its status as an independent nation? The question matters, and it matters a lot, and it's something these polling companies don't understand. Well, what we have here from all of this, though, is whether you take the YouGov numbers or you take the fact that they have been somewhat squished, suppressed, I think that we have a pretty clear idea from both California and Texas that asking the question the wrong way can suppress the support by about 25 to 30 percentage points. But what happens when we apply this across the board to the YouGov numbers, right? So let's just say that we take, because Texas came in, there was about a 35-point difference. California was at 29. So we know there's but let's just take 30. We're going to run a hypothetical here because we've got two very clear examples where that spread was 30-ish points, right? But what happens if we go take that 30 percentage points and we apply it to the YouGov numbers and say, okay, maybe because YouGov asked the question wrong, these percentages should be about 30% higher. Well, then what happens is it puts half of the states in the union at a majority of support for independence, 50% or higher. That means 25 out of 50 states, if it were on a ballot tomorrow, it would win. But more interestingly, it puts another 22 states within striking distance of winning their own exit in a referendum. And what do I mean by striking distance? I mean that they're at, 40, above 40%. They're within 10 points of being at a majority. And so that striking distance is important because it's been shown, we've talked about this before when it comes to referendums, is that there are a lot of factors that can suddenly make up 10 percentage points in an independence referendum. I mean, it's striking distance. If you're at 40+% to start with, then you're in the catbird seat. I mean, you've got the federal government, the pro-Remain side, scrambling like a cat trying to cover crap on a concrete floor. But we know that for over a decade, as I said earlier, there's been a clear upward trend of support for states to withdraw from the union. So these numbers didn't just come from out of nowhere, right? These numbers, they've been growing. They've probably likely been, in the 30 percentile, 20 or 30% starting out. It's just nobody's ever asked them the question the right way. And now, because of the way the federal government is and how broken it is, those numbers are now at a point where you realize that we've got, if you've got half of the union over 50% and 22 other states, that doesn't leave much room for any other states. Right now, granted, there were some states that were left out. They didn't have numbers for Puerto Rico, who's not a state. There were some states where they did not collect enough of a sample size to be able to measure. But I think you could likely make the case at this point that the vast majority of people are ready to go or close enough for it to be problematic, right? So, when you have seen this upward trend of support for independence, You got to understand, as I said, these things didn't just start out from nowhere. They've been growing, and the federal government has had plenty of time to respond. I mean, those first polling numbers for us, we saw I mean, obviously there had been some old polling when we founded the TNM in 2005, but also you had polling in 2009. You had 2010, you had 2011, you had 2014. I mean, it goes on and on. I'm not going to bore you with that because I've talked about it already. But the point here is the federal government had an opportunity to do something about it, right? You know, they see these poll numbers and they see this sentiment just like we do. But the response from the federal government has been to ignore the growing discontent in the states and just pile on more dysfunction and overbearing government from Washington, D.C., who I think, as the ultimate irony, with the adjusted numbers, would be at 61% support for leaving the Union. Now, I'm just going to help you put this in perspective. If you average all of the major polls on Brexit from 2013 to 2016, 2013 was the first year they started seriously polling Remain versus Leave. And of course, the questions were different, but you know, it was very clear. I mean, I'm not going to go dissect every poll that was done for Brexit because it's not important. But if you were to average all of the major polls on an annual basis from 2013 to 2016 on the Brexit issue, the highest ever annual average of support for Leave was 42%. And we all know what the result of that was. Come 2016, when it went on a ballot, the people that didn't get asked in surveys, the people that didn't get asked by pollsters, the people that were not public about their support came out and they voted, and the UK withdrew from the European Union. So it's very clear when you look at this, when you look at this level of support in all these states, including the club that is, vying for the title of most likely to secede, if you're the federal government as an institution, there is no coming back from this. There is no walking this back. You know, they've had, as I said, well over a decade to address these concerns that were leading states, people in these states, to want independence. But now here we are. There is no walking this back. You know, there is no one fix that can be made to the federal system that cures this problem. And so, you know, I've talked about Alaska and Texas and California, all with movements, New Hampshire, all with political movements for independence. All that's left is for many of these states right here that don't have a viable political movement working for independence. All that's left for them is to start one, to do what we've done in Texas, to do what they're doing in California and what they're doing in New Hampshire, what they're doing in Alaska. Because right now, in all these states, independence is low-hanging fruit. And given the sheer number of states with support for withdrawing from the Union, not too far in the distant future, someone may have to hang a sign on the door of the U.S. Capitol that says, "Will the last one out please turn off the lights?" So, friends, that is Texas news for this week. I guess we should maybe think about renaming the podcast, because while this is news that is related to Texas, it is important. I guess you could make that tangential connection, but the bottom line is, look, this is important. It's important to everything that we are doing. When you are seeing self-determination break out like this, and you've got people in the political world or mainstream media saying this is still saying that this is fringe and no one believes in it, understand, we tell Texans all the time, you're not alone, right? The support is there. You have people that believe in Texas independence here in Texas. But I think it's important for Texans and everyone else to understand, hey, guys, we're all thinking the same thing. We're all thinking that it's really an opportunity for us to become self-governing independent nation states and then just negotiate our relationship after that as peers. without the dysfunction of the federal government. So I really hope that you enjoyed this today. I would encourage you, if you have not already liked, subscribed, done all the things to stay connected with the Texas News Podcast, please do so. And if you would like to continue to support not only this podcast, but the work of the Texas Nationalist Movement to bring you this critical news and to advance the cause of Texas independence, head over to tnm.me/join right now. Become a member. Every single member out there helps us keep this phenomenal content going and helps us advance the cause of Texas independence. So with that, that is a wrap for this week's Texas News. I want to thank you so much for joining us, and I will leave you with the words of Sam Houston when he said that Texas will again lift its head and stand among the nations. I believe that time is now, and the question is, will you stand with her?